Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's panel. I'm Martin Millett. I'm president of the Society of Antiquaries. And it's a great pleasure to welcome the panel and a good number of attendees for this discussion. For those of you who aren't aware of the Society, we're a rather elderly established organisation founded in 1707. We've been through a number of different guises over 300 years. Our interest is in the material past and how it reflects people's lives and understanding the world. The Society today is based in Burlington House in Piccadilly, where we have large collections and a library and act as a focus for discussion and debate. And one of the key areas of debate at the moment is the whole area of intertwined history. Delighted that our governance officer, Linda Grant, and communications and events manager, Danielle Higgins, have been working on this. I hope that many of you took part and listened to the excellent presentations on the topic in June, which is now available on YouTube. This is the first of two panel discussions to take some of these ideas further and debate them. And these are issues that aren't sort of foreign to the Society. The Society has been thinking about outreach and its equality and diversity issues for a little while now. Back in 2020, our chair for this afternoon, Natalie Cohen, as a member of council, started leading a group thinking about these issues for the Society. That working party's report formed the basis for the establishment of a new fellowship committee that will be commencing its work in January. We're thinking widely about how we can diversify both our membership and our activities. So I, for one, will be listening very carefully to the ideas that are going to be debated this afternoon. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Natalie, who's going to chair today's session.
Thank you, Martin, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's event. So what I'm going to do this afternoon as the chair is I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn. Upon introduction, I'll ask each of our panelists to give a short position statement about the themes and the topics of what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. And once each of our five panelists has presented, we'll open the floor to questions. So I'm really looking forward to that this afternoon. So I'd like to begin by welcoming Dr. Michael Taylor, who's our first panelist this afternoon. Dr. Taylor is a historian of Britain and the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. His book, The Interest, How the British Establishment Resisted the Abolition of Slavery, which was published in 2020, explores the campaigns both to abolish and to defend slavery that Britons waged in the 1820s and 30s. It was shortlisted for the 2021 Orwell Prize for Political Writing. So welcome, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you very much. So in terms of intertwined histories, one thing that I try to do into it is to integrate the history of slavery into the history of what you might metropolitan Britain, you might call that. Because I think for a very long time, both the historically minded public and historians ourselves have been quite bad at siloing slavery and the slave trade as something that happened over there, as opposed to something that really mattered to the history of Britain domestically. And I think it is unarguable that slavery and the slave trade were integral to Britain. Certainly in the 150 years which preceded the eventual emancipation of enslaved persons in 1904. And in what ways? Well, the first and the most obvious way is economic. In the slave trade and the spin-off economies surrounding the slave trade and slavery were integral to the economic development Atlantic ports like Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, and of course London itself. Consequently, or consequent to the emancipation of slaves, there was £20 million, a truly staggering amount of money for the day, which flooded into the British economy and which went a long way to both developing Britain's railway network in the 1840s and financed the most in British financial and economic history. In terms of maritime history, the development and the success of the Royal Navy was attributed by many people at the time to the slave trade, to the journeys that were made between Britain and the West African coast and then the West Indies. Indeed, Lord Nelson was quite famously somebody who said that he regarded and William IV as well said this as the nursery of the Royal Navy and British maritime. And to include this as well, the subject of my book is really the 10 years between 1823 and 1833, where there were competing campaigns both of slavery. And this involved all of the major political figures of the day. It was debated on some occasions on a daily basis in Parliament. All the political journals, all the political press at the time were paying attention to slavery and emancipation. So domestic Britain are one and the same, at least in this period. And whenever it comes to contested heritage, which is the specific focus of this panel today, I think Britain has a real problem. It's got a certain idea about how we remember slave trade and slavery, because we tend to focus on the abolition and emancipation and not the slave trade and not slavery. Now, obviously, we cannot have one without the other. But the most sophisticated and certainly the most prolific trader in Africans. It was the largest slaveholding imperial power. And it's also important to remember that the abolitionists at the time did not regard abolition and emancipation as a cause for tub thumping and chest beating. These were Christians, they were evangelical Christians who were operating within an intellectual context where own repentance were incredibly important to them. And therefore, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, again, what part of our mythology is that we were the first to do this? We weren't. And whenever then slaves, Britain was not the first major nation or jurisdiction to do this. These were means of atoning for previous past of slave trading. And I think whenever we refer to abolition and emancipation and celebrate those things today, we should bear in mind we're doing something which people did not necessarily do at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Just to let you know, your bandwidth I think is quite low, so I caught most of what you're saying, but it might be easier not to have your camera on sometimes. We'll see how we go with that, and hopefully we can resolve that. Thank you so much for that first statement. The second of our panelists is Professor Miri Rubin, who I'd like to welcome onto the Zoom screen now. I can see her picture, but I cannot see her yet. I'll give you some background to Professor Rubin, and hopefully she will. There she is. Hello. So Professor Rubin is a professor of medieval and early modern history at Queen Mary University of London. She is an historian of Europe who specialises in religious cultures between circa 1000 AD to 1500 in books such as Charity and Community in Medieval Cambridge, Corpus Christi, the Eucharist in Late Medieval Culture, and Gentile Tales, the Narrative Assault on Late Medieval Jews, and Mother of God, 2009, published in 2009. Miri has translated and edited the mid-12th century life and passion of William of Norwich, and she delivered the Wilds Lecture at Queen's University Belfast, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020 as Cities of Strangers. Professor Rubin is a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America, of the Royal Historical Society, and of the Academia Europaea. Since January 2021, she has served as President of the Jewish Historical Society of England. So welcome, Professor Rubin, and please do give us your statement.
Thank you. So my life as an historian has coincided with a vast broadening of what is considered to be history and what historical sources might be. I benefited really as a beginner from the fruits of second wave feminism with histories of women in the 1980s. There were then prompts towards inclusion inspired by the struggles for civil rights in the United States and for self-determination in post-colonial polities. Most historians, though, of pre-modern Europe were and still are sort of wary, modest in their engagements with what they perceive to be the discontents of the modern world, and are often doubtful that an inclusive history could be achieved from the distance of hundreds and hundreds of years in their case, and in the absence of really abundant sources. Nonetheless, some pioneering pre-modern historians understood their academic work as an expression of civic duty and of their politics, and so they wrote wonderful, rigorous histories, say, of the English peasantry, of women, and latterly of Jews, were the main religious minority in England between 1066 and 1290. And even more recently, and thanks to the late Mark Ormrod, we have a wonderful wave of histories of migrants to England, to the British Isles, and of ethnic minorities like, say, Scottish or Flemish people when they dwelt south of the border. Historians have aimed to capture how such groups were represented. Now, in the case of Jews, legislation was clearly exclusionary and theology was damning, but this is really not the full picture. Christians and Jews forged relationships for business, for intimacy, for study, even for conviviality, despite the preaching that urged them otherwise. We also find that relations with groups marked by some sort of difference changed dramatically over time, with relative openness to such groups in periods of prosperity and opportunity, and exclusion, even violence, in periods like after the Black Death, when opportunities were more constrained. All this is to say that so-called minorities are becoming part of British history, and yet historians, teachers, educationalists, curators are still trying to figure out where they fit in and how much energy and space, sometimes literal space, on a page or in an exhibition should be invested in the incorporation of them into an imagined mainstream national history. So I've witnessed some taking a proportionate approach, literally. That is to say, maybe they should take up the space that they represent in the population. Now, of course, the proportionate approach is not unfamiliar, and people who strive for social justice often say, okay, we have a target. We want 10% BAME judges or 50% CEOs who are women. That proportional approach is appropriate, at least as a starting point. But historians are working into a past that was lived and experienced. They document what people actually they document what people actually did and in what sectors they acted. And this often shows that minorities were allowed, able to act in surprisingly prominent ways. So, for example, when studying the finances of the English crown in the 12th and 13th centuries, the just 3,000 Jews, a minute group among England's population of 1.5 or 1.8 million at the time, loom extremely large. This because they were expected to do fiscal work within the machinery of the state, as they had been expected since their arrival from Normandy with William the Conqueror in 1066. In a land with no national taxation, the sums raised from Jews under his protection formed the substantial basis for a king's budget, and so affected his ability to act in building sumptuously, or recruiting mercenaries, or celebrating lavishly royal marriages and coronations. And because this income from Jews mattered so much, a whole Department of State was created, the Exchequer of the Jews, to document and so scrutinize their business, which was, of course, tax yielding at the end of the day. So the Jews were a tiny minority, yes, but they are an essential part in the history of the fiscal state, of course, until their expulsion in 1290, and in other ways too, like, for example, if we move briefly just to the world of ideas and beliefs, their representation in images and on objects There again, Jews abounded. They were everywhere. Their centrality to the founding myths of Christianity meant that preachers, artists, theologians, canon lawyers commented on them, inveighed against them, sought to convert them, were fascinated by what they did in the privacy of synagogues and homes, and used them as touchstones for the morality of Christians, that is, as a counterexample. All this produced a vast literature, learned as well as popular, in Latin as well as the vernacular, and it resulted in the birth in England of the gruesome myth, literary myth, of ritual murder of children imputed to Jews. So we cannot really study Chaucer or Shakespeare, giants of British literary history, without spending time with their Jewish figures. Groups seen as different are ordinary, like all of us. They're men and women and father and mothers, and they're just in search of a decent life. Yet the history of how they have become entangled means that they must sometimes loom actually very large, at the very center, not at the margins, despite their small numbers. And there they should be. Can one imagine the history of post-war Britain, the history of the NHS, say, without the Windrush generation, or that of the British left without Jews acting in trade unions or for social justice? I would even say more. There are times when those underrepresented or historically underrepresented become the most reliable, the most knowing and trenchant tellers of our histories, impassioned as they are by their experiences and memories which had for so long been suppressed. Think of the impact of David Olusoga's TV histories and books, or the short films we all watched during lockdown, Steve McQueen's exquisite series, Small Axes. And recently, of course, there's Ridley Road, an account of racism against East End Jews in the 1960s. There are times when histories of minorities must be allowed to rush over us, wash over us with their passion, their excellence, and their call to become part of an entangled national story.
Thank you so much, Professor Rubin. I'd like now to turn to our third panelist, who's Shahid Saleem, and just hoping that he is coming on screen momentarily. So by way of introduction and welcome, Shahid Saleem is an architect, lecturer, and author, and he teaches architecture at the University of Westminster. His book, The British Mosque, An Architectural and Social History, was published in 2018 by Historic England and is the first comprehensive account of Muslim architecture in Britain. Saleem has co-curated the V&A Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2021 on the theme of the mosque in Britain. Both his design and research work centers on Muslim architecture and space making, and he expands these to look at wider themes of heritage, significance, and belonging in the urban environment. Welcome.
Thank you very much. After having listened to those really just excellent and mesmerizingly interesting presentations, I sort of feel like I want to talk about something slightly different to notes that I'd prepared, but I think we can probably do all that in the conversation. I mean, as you said, my work focuses, and it ties in very much to what Mary is talking about, on the history of Muslim migrant communities in Britain. And what I've done through my research into the mosque is to write a sort of story or a narrative of the architectural production, of the architectural product, as it were, of those migrant communities. Earliest mosque being in the late 19th century, and charting the development of the mosque as an architectural and social history throughout the 120 or so years, and then and creating sort of established kind of historical record, which documents that process of settlement of migrant communities from many different locations. I mean, the thing that I'm not going to talk too much about that now, because we can maybe talk about that in the conversation, and in particular the way in which that sort of has manifested in the exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which is called Three British Mosques, and its reconstruction of three mosques, of the elements of three mosques, have been reconstructed as one-to-one replicas as the V&A Pavilion. And one of those is the Brick Lane Mosque, which started life as a Huguenot chapel in 1743, and then was a Methodist chapel, and then it was a synagogue, and then it was a mosque. So that building really kind of encapsulates this whole notion of kind of intertwined and interconnected migrant stories. One of the things I've been doing over the last couple of years, I suppose, and particularly since the summer of 2020, is learning, having more and more conversations and more awareness about the way in which the work that I've done, for example, is situated within a wider kind of structural narrative. And I think that there is now a much more a wider acceptance of the interconnectedness between race and migration and capitalism and climate. And what I find interesting is that the way that these three kind of potentially disconnected categories in people's minds are being understood now as being more entwined and interdependent, and also as structures which have come to define our contemporary Euro-American world and worldview. There's one example that I heard by the geographer David Harvey when he was speaking, and he notes that in the summer of 2020, there's a New York Times columnist, Paul Krugman, and he wrote, and I quote, Krugman's quote, "The core story of US politics over the past 4 decades is that wealthy elites weaponized white racism to gain political power, which they used to pursue policy that enriched the already wealthy at workers' expense. Republicans have spent decades exploiting racial hostility to win elections." And what Krugman says is that until Trump's rise, people could deny this reality or not be aware of it, let's say. But he says that after Trump, it requires what he calls willful blindness not to see what was going on. And what I think is interesting is this is a kind of op-ed piece in a kind of a mainstream, newspaper, as a national newspaper. And I think Krugman is observing a truth of European economic and political history since the beginnings of slavery. And that is that race has been deployed by the economically powerful as an integral part of a network of strategies which maintain an economic system that concentrates wealth in their hands. The colonial project was not only, therefore, an economic project, but also cultural and social. And it framed the non-European as the inferior other to the pinnacle of the European, or the kind of European sort of white identity that it privileged. And also there's more awareness, I think, of the way in which architecture and landscapes across Britain have been shaped by the proceeds of colonization and slavery. And you're probably aware of the National Trust report into the connection between its properties and slavery and colonialism. And in that report, there is acknowledgement that the practice of enslaving African people was a fundamental part of the British economy from the late 17th to the early 19th centuries. The report recognizes that architecture such as the country house, because it's looking particularly at the kind of legacy of country houses in the National Trust properties. Country houses act as a dynamic site in which global and national histories are played out in a local setting. And that they represent a complex set of transnational influences that lies behind the design of the buildings, gardens, and parklands. And I'm quoting from the report, and also that that there is at play a constellation of dynamic processes by which British built environments absorbed and reflected global material cultures. So I think it's very it's very pertinent and evident now that these kind of descriptions of our built environment and architecture are becoming much more accepted and recognized. And obviously they were always known, but perhaps known in sort of specifically historical circles. But I think there is now a wider recognition of the connection between race and capital. And so while the historic built environment from the 18th century is embedded in the racialized global histories of slavery and colonization, it's recognized that has led us to our present economic system, which is extractive and expansive. And I think this is where the connection with climate is also starting to come in, that this economic system, which is built on race and capital, is fundamentally extractive and based on growth, and extractive in a number of ways and based on growth as a core principle. So the climate emergency has shown this economic system of continuous growth to be unsustainable, and indeed to have brought us to the brink of climate collapse. The centrality of the consumer of cheap products and cheap labor are being widely questioned in the West, or are being questioned in the West anyway, with concepts such as degrowth and anti-work and so on. So I believe that through the wider recognition and critique of the interconnectedness between race, economy, and climate, there is the potential for new forms of intertwined and interconnected histories that might genuinely disrupt the European order founded on slavery and colonization that has shaped our modern world. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That really sets the themes for a lot of the discussions that I hope will follow here, building on the words of our first two panelists there, and particularly appropriate given the climate conference started already, underway, and mention of the National Trust report, which obviously the National Trust AGM is tomorrow. So it will be very interesting to see, what kind of responses are coming out from the membership at that point. Thank you so much. So I'd now like to turn to our fourth panelist and welcome back, in fact, Josephine Beaton, who presented for us as well in June. So Josephine has contributed research from various sources to numerous articles on early African and American jazz and blues, including the Black Music Research Journal in 2009 to 2010, the Center for Black Music Research at Columbia College, Chicago, John Chilton's book, Sidney Bechet, The Wizard of Jazz, published in 1987, besides as well as contributing articles on individual artists and bands touring through the British Isles and Europe. Pardon me, excuse me, sorry, I'm still recovering from a slight cold. Hello, Josephine. Josephine is a retired East End Secondary School head teacher, currently heavily involved in the Nubian Jack Communities Trust project, in honor of the Windrush and Commonwealth nurses, and a book to accompany that statue. So I'd like to welcome Josephine Beaton back to the floor, and please do give us your statement, Josephine.
Thank you. The primary purpose of the Nubian Jack Community Trust is the promotion of activities to foster understanding between people from diverse backgrounds. It aims to promote equality and diversity for the public benefit, particularly but not exclusively with Britain's African Caribbean community, by eliminating discrimination on grounds of race, advancing education and raising awareness on equality and diversity, promoting activities to foster understanding between people from diverse backgrounds and of different racial groups. I want to highlight the advantages of memorialization as it plays out. The Trust has raised more than 60 blue plaques and counting. When a plaque is unveiled, the ceremony involves speakers recounting the particular contributions made by the person, either historians and or those who knew the individual, including family members. Civic representatives and high commissioners are invited, and on most occasions, a class of school children will have been given the story, then produced artworks, poems, newspapers, etc., perhaps conducting an assembly for the rest of the school. An individual such as Cy Grant, famous to many for his calypsos on the TV, was revealed to be also a World War II RAF radio navigator, amongst other things. In 1773, a London bookseller published the first book of poems written by Phyllis Wheatley, African American. What does that say about England of the time? The plaques cover a wide range, include men and women, and in one case, a British Jewish woman, Raun Laslett, who started up a little book community festival. Her plaque faces that of Claudia Jones, who took the development further to what became the Notting Hill Carnival. And the plaques are permanently on show for all to see. The War Memorial in Brixton Square to those of African descent who gave their lives to both world wars and later conflicts, not only give thanks to the war dead, but a focus for veterans and the families of veterans. It invites an ongoing involvement of the public in general as commemorating services take place, and draws many visitors, including from abroad, who come to see it. It's a teaching tool for local schools. The nurse's statue and companion book, Nursing a Nation, are now achieved. The book has historical essays and biographies, but the core of the book is a set of first-hand accounts by Windrush nurses describing why they came to Britain, their training, their career path, and their experiences, good and bad. This makes the book a particularly good tool for schools and colleges in broad terms, but also to promote the true stories of nurses who are alive now. They almost universally met crude racism and hostility as they practiced, and were often put on the lower level state enrolled nurse course rather than the state registered nurse course that they expected. Some nurses were lucky enough to meet a doctor who spotted their ability. They all persevered and won through. At least 2 of them have just been asked to Black History events, one a school which is videoing the speech. As a teacher, I like the multiple talents revealed by the plaques, because when the rediscovery of Mary Seacole was made, she and Martin Luther King were repeatedly held up as examples in primary and secondary schools. And this might well suggest that they were the only 2 great historical characters there ever were. The wrong message to all sides. Similarly, if all that is taught about Africans is slavery, what message is that giving to a diverse class? That Africans are just victims and Europeans stronger? And if it's all plantations, does that not reinforce the message? If we want to foster equality and diversity through education, equality is the core value which must apply to everyone, students and staff alike. The medium is the message. If children have to queue for a school dinner, then so should teachers, not march to the front of the queue. Intertwined history is a complex thing. I've known of schools and inspectors that think multicultural history is only needed if there's a multicultural intake. But there will be children whose parents are both racist and prejudiced, and any direct challenge to change the child's view will fail. In the context of equality and respect, school assemblies are a good way to deal with this if the right indirect approach is taken. My own favourite assembly was the importance of reading, and how in the USA slaveholders did not want the enslaved to become educated. Cue Frederick Douglass, whose master was angry when he found his wife teaching him the alphabet and forbade it. Frederick then learned from poor white boys in the area in exchange for giving them food. As a house slave, he was well fed, and ironically could easily manage to give these ill-fed boys bread in exchange. He later wrote a book about his life and the evils of slavery. This story turns a number of expectations upside down for a diverse audience. But today, it remains important to celebrate also the achievements of those within living memory who have not been acknowledged in the way that important white people have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. So finally, I'd like to welcome our 5th panelist for this afternoon's discussion. I'd also like to encourage people to start thinking about some questions that they would like to ask our panelists, or raising some points for discussion as we move towards the end of the position statements. So welcome to Dr. Oh, sorry, my video has gone on and gone off again. Hold on just a moment. Hello, I'm back. Welcome to Dr. Laura Maktakni, who is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. Originally from Belfast in Northern Ireland, she has several research interests, including contemporary archaeology and heritage of post-Good Friday Agreement Northern Ireland, experiences of Irish political imprisonment, and the archaeology and heritage of the colonial Caribbean. Welcome to you, Laura.
Thank you. And Jess, I have been getting a lot of inspiration from everybody else's papers. So I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be involved in this, and I'll try to keep limited to a couple of minutes. I've written notes because there's a lot to say about in terms of legacies of colonialism in Ireland, so I can only really touch on a couple of issues. Historian Brian Hanley recently wrote in the Irish Times, Ireland and Britain, of course, share history, but they do not share an equal history. Only one was conquered by the other, and only one became a global empire. I will be dissecting that statement through this short position piece. Britain and/or England have an entangled history with Ireland due to geographical proximity that we can see archaeologically involved a lot of cultural exchange over millennia. Focus of when that relationship became more definitively unequal, exploitative, and involved the domination by force pushes us to the early modern period onwards, when features that we recognize in terms of European colonial exploitation take a more structured and systemic form. A note on terminology is that historically Irish writers tended not to use the word colonial to describe the relationship with England and Britain, and there have been claims that it's anachronistic to do so. Whereas Sean Ryder, writing in 2005, has argued for the need to be more reflexive in how words such as colonial and empire were used historically, and to consider their highly loaded associations with progress and modernity, or lack thereof, in the past. So to not use the word colonial doesn't really mean that there wasn't a colonial relationship. While it did differ across time and space, the nature of the relationship cannot be in doubt. Jane Allmeyer has labelled the plantations from the late 16th century, particularly in Ulster, as laboratories of empire. And since the 17th century until independence, Ireland's relationship with Britain has been shaped by plantations, penal laws, and partition, all of which ingrained unequal relationships and are features of colonialism. But over time and space, and undoubtedly by virtue of race or Ireland's historical whiteness, Irish people have been able to navigate a place in which they were not only victims but perpetrators, and using Michael Rothberg's term, implicated subjects in the British Empire. My work in the Caribbean as part of the SLAM project on Montserrat, and now my own project on St. Croix, which is part of the Danish West Indies, provides many indications that Irish people were able to navigate the British Empire and other empires in ways that were not open to everyone. For example, Montserrat was known as the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean, due to it being the only colony in the Caribbean that had a majority white population that was Irish. The historical and archaeological record is patchy and incomplete due to the nature of colonialism, but also because of environmental disasters such as hurricanes and volcanic eruptions. But what we can tell was that Irish people historically made up all echelons of society, and that they did not necessarily see themselves as holding common cause or common identity. They were as much determined by class or status as their national origins. However, the perceived disloyalty to the English crown, particularly if they were assumed to be Catholic, meant that even governors such as William Stapleton were not invulnerable and were unable to always hold position, power, and possessions. Indeed, Stapleton had the bad fortune to die while presumed Catholic. He did change religion a number of times around the time of the Glorious Revolution, and his widow spent many years trying to prove his loyalty to the crown to get back confiscated lands. Academically, the nature and legacies of Hiberno-British relations, including colonialism, have been discussed and debated many times, and just as often not discussed and debated due to the fluctuations and uncertainties in the present. In Guy Beaner's recent book, Unforgetful Remembrance, which relates to the 1798 rebellion by Ulster Presbyterians, primarily, I should say, not just, he has noted the role of the contemporary in shaping how we remember and forget. He also commented, the questions posed by historians of Ireland, however, have been constrained by concerns that irresponsible explorations of the past may have harmful ramifications, in particular when it comes to the province of Ulster, perceived by some as the Black North. So in addressing the issues of legacies, of course, there are many legacies that can be explored, but following Laura Stoller, we must also look to the enduring nature of colonialism and how it is retained in structures, logics, institutions, and administration that survive independence in many colonies, but particularly in the South, and of course are maintained in the North and Ireland. We cannot ignore that we're in the year deemed the centenary of partition, which was really a process rather than a neutral rupture tied to a date, and it did involve violence and displacement across the island. And whilst there are very different interpretations of what that act meant and means, it is difficult to discuss legacies of colonialism in Ireland today without considering the enduring impact of those actions and policies in Ireland. And that must include the impact of Brexit, particularly since 2016, in reactivating the border as a live issue and raising the national question in ways that cannot be ignored and cannot be separated from historical colonial relationships. These major change in Hiberno-British relationships are a key defining point in the present. And as such, whenever we're talking about legacies and memory, it does direct not only how we navigate relationships now, but how we look back on the past and its legacies. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. There's a huge amount for us to think about there. What I'd like to do is to invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras back on and their microphones on as well, so that we could open some of the discussion. First and foremost, I guess, was there anything within the presentations that we've just seen from each of you that the panelists would like to raise as a point for further discussion before either that, or I have some thoughts I can kick off. But I wondered whether, after hearing such a broad range of topics raised, whether there were questions that our panelists had for each other to begin the discussion. Miri is raising her hand. Do you please?
I'm raising my hand quickly because my internet is really not good. I'm not the only one apparently, but I'm afraid I'm going to disappear at some point. I just wanted to say, I mean, just the issue of material culture and things and spaces and buildings, also like Shahid said, and which means that you can have continuities and shared meanings around spaces and places that if you looked at sort of, formal positions, as it were, between groups, you wouldn't guess were possible. And I think that's really important to trace. And of course, East London, which I inhabit at Queen Mary, is a fantastic place for that exactly sort of examination to happen through trips, through engagement of school children. I'm just thinking of Josephine's contribution. So it's very much histories that are not just histories based on official documentation or even on the written, and to capture all of that is extremely important. But it also means that we all have to really open ourselves to what is in there in those in those collections, great and small, and to work particularly with curators, and that means partnerships between academia and non-academic institutions, of course.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think certainly. I should disclaimer, I work for the National Trust, so obviously these conversations that have been very much in the news for the last couple of years around the report that was issued during 2020 and continuing discussions around places, and that spirit of place is something that we talk about a lot, and I wonder whether people are feeling that their connection to that spirit of place is disrupted, and that's why we have such an extreme response to something that is and just picking up on one comment from the audience, it is a proportionate approach. It's part of the fabric of those places to talk about these different aspects of the history, of the archaeology, of how they came to be. So I've followed the discussion with both horror and interest. It's been a particularly volatile environment to work in, but something that makes me extremely proud that we are finally addressing some of these more challenging aspects of our places.
I think the vituperative responses to the National Trust's recent report on its properties links to colonialism and slavery is completely ahistorical. It's informed by nostalgia, which is something very different. And I think people regret the disintegration of an idea that, say, Harwood House outside Leeds is part of merry old England, without considering where the money came from to buy this lovely place. And the Harwoods, if anybody listening or watching doesn't know, were probably the largest slaveholders on Barbados. And the Earl of Harwood, until he finally was told, apparently, that such horrendous offences were taking place on his Caribbean properties, was a stalwart defender of slavery and of the slave trade. I think the present Earl of Harwood has actually responded quite elegantly, and he says quite fairly that I can't be accountable for what my forebears did or how they got their money, but I am responsible now for reacting to that historical reality. But sorry, that's something I think that needs to be said.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely, to me, it's hugely admirable what the National Trust has done, and hugely sort of gives hope, I think, to many people, and pursuing the kind of cause, as well as other kind of historical work. And I think what's interesting for me is the way in which we are now becoming much more kind of literate at looking historically at things which we might otherwise look at kind of horizontally. So I think, say, within, like as Miri was saying, for example, within the East End, it's very easy to talk about the East End as a place of kind of, and it is a place of diversity, because there's large Bangladeshi communities and so on, and there's kind of recent migration in the last 30, 40 years where those communities are still there. But actually what we're also able to do is look vertically at the kind of go back into sort of 100, 150 or so, say 200 years, and look at the ways in which the interconnections between communities who are there now are shared throughout a kind of longer historical period. And I think that's something that's and again, that's why it's important, the work that's being done, like as Martin and other historians are doing, looking at these kind of connections between slavery and colonialism. And one of the reasons we chose the Brick Lane Mosque is because of that longevity of use, and through that building we can go backwards and show these kind of layers of interconnections between different migrant communities, and the issues that people have faced, the issues that different communities have faced are similar in different, experienced differently, but there's the similarities. So yeah, no, I think it's all quite positive work that's been done.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that I think it's, again, what the National Trust has done is touch the nerve, because it's the kind of stories that people want to pretend don't exist and don't have connections between the past and the present. But, elites today were often formed from elites in the past, and the structural inequalities that were created by capitalism and modernity are not things that have went away. We're not in a classless society where people are able to navigate that without having come from a background often where they're advantaged by what happened in the past. So I think those connections between past and present are quite important. And then tying into the issue about materials, as an archaeologist, what I became really interested in was that materials can tell us different stories than documents. Documents are not often written by the people who are at the lowest echelons of society, and they're not often written about them and to control them. So I think that it's important to find different ways to be able to locate stories about, particularly those who are not writing the historical record and are also being recorded in ways which often is detrimental to how we remember them if we only use those type of archives. So I'm really interested in, material memory and the fact that stuff survives, that is in collections, is in our streets, is in our buildings, that can tell us different types of stories, and much more entangled and complicated stories than documents often can do by themselves.
Absolutely. We have a couple of questions come in. One which is for Dr. Taylor, I think. I'm just asking if you could clarify which was the first major power to abolish enslavement apart from Haiti?
So Haiti, whenever it became independent in 1804, abolished slavery in its constitution. Before that, France had abolished slavery. The convention, the convention abolished slavery in 1794, even though Napoleon later reinstated it. Elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere, whenever all of the Spanish colonies sort of released themselves from the Spanish Empire, Gran Colombia, the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, which became Argentina, Mexico, Central America, which was a state which is a much wider state than say Nicaragua, Honduras today. They had all abolished slavery before Britain abolished slavery. Whenever we get to the United States, we need to recognize that slavery was an issue for the individual states themselves. The future of slavery was a federal issue, but the individual states controlled whether or not they had slavery. Every northern state had begun to abolish slavery by 1804. In terms of the federal consequences, every state above the Missouri Compromise line would be free from 1820, and all of what we might now regard as the American Midwest, which was the Northwestern Territory, had been created in 1787, and it was going to be free as well. So the idea that Britain was first and leading the way in abolishing enslavement and slavery is just not true.
Yeah, it's an interesting example, that, isn't it, of yet another example of maybe English. It comes back to that point around nostalgia and how the English view themselves, or this idea that it rightly to be proud of having abolished enslavement. However, the projection of how that's presented is completely at odds with the reality of the factual sort of historical development. So
yeah, and I think this has happened for three main reasons. The first is that the abolitionists wrote to the histories of slavery.
Coming back to Laura's point.
The second is that the pro-slavery individuals managed to whitewash their own personal histories and managed to represent themselves as actually having been anti-slavery all along. The third is just, with all historical mythologies, it's just a nicer story to tell about yourselves, and it's much easier to tell that story rather than actually it was quite complicated, and abolition was piecemeal and difficult, and it was resisted by a large number of very influential people in Britain.
Absolutely. Mary.
Morag Cross raises makes two interesting comments that I think will help us clarify things, particularly after we just heard that very useful clarification about slavery. So Morag, I think we're here not so much to talk about history itself, but we're here really to talk about, dare I use the word meta today, meta history, that is to say, how do we go about organizing our history? So you're quite right that we're maybe jumping from Ireland to slavery to the Middle Ages and so on. But in a way, I think we are all in the same conversation, in as much as we're trying to think about how to produce, how to shape some sort of national history. And indeed, like Josephine, some of us have to teach it, and some of us have to curate it, and some of us have to write about it for diverse audiences, and some of us, we're not all academics here, but so it seems to me that we're just coming, each of us, from a different area of particular interest, but I think we're all really thinking about the question about how to weave that a fabric together. And that also, if I may just say, that your earlier question about, so why are we concentrating on witches? That's an excellent example of exactly what I was trying to say, that yes, witches who were burnt in Scotland in the 16th and 17th century, they were only a few thousands, but in terms of what it represented about, first of all, the enormity, obviously, of the violence, what it represented about people's ideas, what could pass, what could not pass, what the state saw its responsibilities of being, what religious ideas were, all of that means that we are drawn to that episode and we want to engage with it because it tests us as well in terms of our values now. So that's exactly what I was trying to say, that it isn't the numbers or the percentages, although they do have their values in setting targets, I did admit that, but that there will be even maybe what seem to be sort of numerically or small in size sort of events, but nonetheless that really make us think very, very hard about what we value today and what we can learn, of course, from the past as well.
I'm just catching up on the comments. Okay. A question for Michael. Your book exposes the pro-slavery realities of many of our so-called heroes. It challenges the hagiographical attention they've been given. What has the reaction been like from those who hero worship these figures, thinking of politicians, descendants of these pro-enslavement figures, and members of the establishment?
I've only been contacted by one descendant of one of these figures, and it was a descendant of Nelson. Although I should say that somebody like Nelson, who expressed an opinion in favor of maintaining enslaved colonies, is very, very different from, say, somebody like Peel or Wellington, who actively used political power to preserve those institutions. Other than that, there's been one, I would urge you all to go and read it, just this hilariously inept hatchet job in The Critic, which, if you know, it's an incredibly right-wing magazine. It's like The Spectator for people for whom The Spectator isn't right-wing enough. That's been the only really vicious reaction. The rest of it, I think, has been quite positive because, you know, I did a lot of research. It's pretty irrefutable. If you put thousands of notes and references into it, you can't present something as propaganda.
Thank you. Okay. So I think what I'd like to do is just come back to the some of the themes that were picked up earlier in Josephine's talk around education and engagement and outreach, and how with all of these very and you know, sort of touching back on the point of the broadness of this discussion, that we are jumping across big time periods and we're looking at lots of different sort of aspects of enslavement, colonialism globally, while trying to sort of focus in a little bit on Britain, and thinking about, we've spoken a little bit about how we talk about or how some organizations are talking about and presenting some of these different aspects that we've been discussing. So maybe just a question from me, if that's okay, for Josephine, around sort of schools and engagement, and how, you know, how we can, I wanted to sort of touch on some of those ideas around widening discussions and sort of expanding curricula, if that's okay, and just thinking about how we can maybe embed or help to embed that more widely at that kind of schools level, rather than it being a much more sort of academic or adult conversation, and whether you had thoughts on that. Oh, you'll need your microphone on, sorry.
I think one of the difficulties that teachers have is that they may not know all the stuff either. And it's very important to provide the material that they can use. And this has been an ongoing thing. When I was teaching in the 1970s, there was a big thing about looking at textbooks. So geography books, for example, would always show pictures of starving African villagers. They wouldn't show the big towns. So you need some of that right material, and it may be that teachers need to find their own materials on occasion if they know what they're looking for. It's the same thing as like men and women. At the school where I was a deputy head, and we were looking at promoting girls to do well in a rather rough school. I took a group of children round and did a survey of what was on classroom walls. So if you're in, say, a technical area, if there's one picture of a woman, that's considered all right. Whereas it's really saying there aren't many of them. And I've done the same in another school, looking at the number of Black people. on walls. And it's just the same thing. There's a token thing, and people need to be able to put the stories behind it. One of the myths we've got, talking about how the victors like to write their own mythology, is this thing about the Second World War. We beat the Germans. We didn't. We and our empire beat the Germans. Nobody mentions the Indians. Nobody mentions although I have met kids who knew their grandfather was in the Second World War, driving tanks and things like that. But there is material that you have to look for. And maybe what we need to do is to give a kind of, perhaps make a kind of map of, these are the things, these are topics that are dealt with. They need to include this, that, and the other, because otherwise you're just going round in circles. Teachers, certainly in urban areas, are very willing to make sure that they're being inclusive. I have to say it's not always the same in rural schools.
Sorry, Mary has sorry to interrupt you, Josephine. Mary just has her hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I've had a really good experience with the Runnymede Trust through the way they worked on the history, because sometimes waiting until there's a national revision of curricula, it's just too long, it's too vexed, and everybody gets there involved. And so civil society institutions like the Runnymede Trust produces the most extraordinarily good. I was involved in the history of migration it's called Our Island Story, which is like very, very nice sort of irony there. And it's all about migration from the beginning, I think, from the Roman period, I think, and went through. I contributed to the medieval, colleagues of mine throughout, with wonderful materials, with maps and so on. So I think it's a better sort of route, really, is through committed institutions of civil society. I also feel right now, during the lockdown, somebody asked really interestingly about lockdown in the last 18 months and so on, through the issue of BLM and George Floyd and so on. But in fact, I think that a lot of museums during the lockdown, where they really revisited their offerings, and it was really interesting to see, just so many museums that I follow on Twitter or that I visit, how much they've done in order to increase the issue to work, because they just had the space and time to do so on issues of inclusion, but particularly on issues of outreach. So, but again, I think you're right, Josephine. There is this issue of which, how much harder it is from rural areas to get over more, sort of less densely populated areas to get kids around and so on, to these sort of places, and of course the cost that's involved. But I'm thinking that work with museums is really, really important.
Agreed. Thank you. Can I have a question from Sadie Watson, just asking if we could ask Laura the same question about Northern Ireland and schools education, and thinking about segregation within schools on religious grounds, and what a challenge this may be for the whole for Northern Ireland and also the island of Ireland in terms of teaching resources.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, because as you know, most people know, I think most of the schools in Northern Ireland are segregated. There is a number that are integrated, and there's a greater push for that, but they are essentially two different types of schools. Also, the history curriculum in Northern Ireland is not focused on having to study these things in great detail. There's still a lot of focus on traditional, studying the Tudors and things like that. So you can go through a Northern Irish school and do history to leaving to the university and not have studied any Irish history at all. So, and to understand the links between, in Ireland and Britain, and the complications of that and complexities are not, a given that everybody will actually come out of school and know any of those things. So I think it is a real challenge, and it's not just about the schools being segregated, it's about the schools deciding to do subjects that they think are safer, and they don't want to do things that they think are more difficult. But I do think actually the more I find from my own work, I do, quite controversial subjects in Irish history. So I study imprisonment, and I study particularly experiences of civil war, experiences of the Troubles. And I find actually that most people are quite open to knowing about other people's stories. I think we underestimate how much people actually are open to knowing that different people had different experiences of them. Like, I've worked with a lot of ex-prisoners, including when I did work on the Maze prison, and they were more interested in each other's stories than they were in anything else. They were, you know, kind of fascinated to hear how people who were in the prison at the same time as them in different parts actually had quite different understandings of what went on. So I thought that was, in myself, I've never had really bad pushback over some of the stuff I've done, which can seem quite controversial, but actually just more of an interest in understanding more about the past, the recent past and the distant past, and actually how sometimes it tells us different things than we, you know, were brought up to think.
Yeah, just judging by the flag behind Laura, I think we probably grew up within a couple of miles of each other. I did precious little Irish history at school, and when I did it, it was the safe stuff, like the Normans building Carrickfergus Castle, or how you know, Belfast people lived here. We've still got before we can begin controversial stuff.
Yeah, like I find it interesting because I did Irish history in the school I went to. It went up to kind of the 1970s. And some of it, you know, now you would think, I'm kind of surprised they did that. But then I did my, you know, it was around the 90s, the mid 90s. I think since that time, it's actually got much more focused on history being about reconciliation and the peace process, but not figuring out that you need to start with actual people need to understand the past before you can reconcile it. You can't reconcile it without having an understanding of what happened. So I think, you know, there seems to have been different times and actual focus that's just much more about the contemporary than actually understanding the past a lot more. So I think it's interesting, and I've spoke to younger people who I know are historians coming through. They've actually had a very different experience of school than I did, for good and for ill.
Moving the focus slightly, and looking sort of more sector-wide now, we've got another question. So how do you think, this is a question to all of our panelists, how do you think the last year has impacted the sector? And do you think the focus on Black Lives Matters has had a lasting impact? Have you seen any big or positive, or hopefully big and positive changes within your area of research that will benefit the cultural sector as we move forward? So there's quite a lot to unpick in that question, and I don't know if anyone would like to sort of take an aspect of that to talk about the last year, the opportunity maybe to talk more openly. I think coming back to Laura's point around, you know, there's been perhaps a perception of hesitancy around talking about some of these issues that we've been discussing today, but actually audiences are open to learning more about more diverse histories. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to start with that, with a conversation around that. Or if not, I have another question lined up, ready to go.
Can I say something actually I think is kind of interesting in terms of discussions, because I live in Denmark, but obviously I don't come from Denmark. And they have similar kind of conversations about their colonial legacies. But actually, I think in some ways, Britain's ones are much more advanced. In Denmark, it's actually, there has been, I think, a bit more of a pushback against talking about diversity in the past and colonial legacies because of this idea that Black Lives Matter has nothing to do with them, when actually, you know, the legacies in Denmark are not having populations that come from their colonies, but actually it's much easier to not have those discussions. And I'm doing a project on Danish colonialism, which in the last year has got a little more difficult because of that, because there's not, you know, a desire from a government kind of background to have those conversations, which may have existed maybe, you know, 3 or 4 years ago. I think actually in Britain, there seems to be a lot more openness to that. Even if there is pushback, there's not at the same level that like I'm witnessing in my kind of northern situation at the minute.
It's interesting. I wonder how long, I mean, it doesn't feel at the moment like there's a lot of government openness in England around having these kinds of conversations. We have a specific question for Shahid, if that's okay. How have religious spaces, mosques in particular, been infused with the cultural spaces they're built within, and the area that our audience member lives in, there has been a mosque built in a more modern style. Is this happening in more places, and is it just a design choice, or is it something else? So I guess this is another question around the kind of placemaking aspect. Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to a design choice in that there isn't specifically a religious requirement to design in a particular way. So there isn't a kind of sacred or scriptural requirement for mosque architecture. So I find what happens is that, you know, through the kind of 80s, 90s, a kind of earlier period of post-war mosque building, a lot of communities were trying to kind of make direct references to historic sources, which they were kind of seeing or remembering from places that they might have come from. So there was a much more kind of attempts to kind of literally replicate parts of historic Islamic architecture in British mosques, which were either purpose-built, starting to become purpose-built, or adapted buildings. I sort of identified in my book that around the mid-90s, there was actually a sort of turn towards a more kind of historicist approach to mosque architecture, particularly in new buildings that were being built in the Midlands and in the north of England. So there was a kind of turn towards a sort of historicism in a way, where when people started to build more purpose-built mosques, had more resources, they were actually trying to, it seems like they were trying to kind of replicate historic Islamic architecture, how they perceived kind of authentic Islamic architecture in a more sort of whole and intact way. So I think the modern representations, or the modern versions, are a kind of minority in terms of a general trend. And it really, again, yeah, it really does come down to the particular designer and the congregation. And in many cases, because mosques are organized as the community organizations, they have a committee, you know, they have a kind of democratic process as organizations. They often have to cater to what is the easiest thing that the congregation is going to accept. And often that ends up being more kind of historic and traditional sort of designs. So it does take quite a brave, you know, people or mosque to sort of divert from that. So some do, but yeah, I think largely they're kind of, it's easier to kind of stick to known architectural, you know, styles, I think.
Josephine? Thank you.
I think there may be a general thing about when people choose to migrate. Some of my distant relatives, for example, have gone to America or to Australia. And when they migrate, they keep in touch with the people back home. And they're the people who keep a record of their relatives and their children and all that kind of stuff. They kind of want to hang on, not to feel separated from their relatives. And I wonder if that would also apply in the mosques that, as were just referred to. There was also, and I think this was in the 90s, but I may be wrong, a Hindu temple built in London, which is built in pink stone, which was shipped from India and was carved by Indian carvers. So it's got all the lovely elephants and that kind of stuff on it, you know. And I think for some people, it may not be that they haven't changed and they know they've changed, but they feel comfortable with knowing that there's something that they've brought from their homeland with them.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And I think, you know, often we see that diasporas hold on to kind of ideas about home quite enthusiastically, and those ideas about home are often, you know, not necessarily kind of, well, I say realistic, but not necessarily kind of nuanced with the complexities of you know, the actual place that they've left, you know, the complexities of that place as it changes and so on. So in a way, I think you're right. I think once people have migrated and once they form diasporic communities, then the kind of need to be able to create symbols which are kind of perhaps reductive, but they can be sort of emotionally or attached to in a more kind of direct way. So I think that does all play into the architectural choices that people are making. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. I'd like to ask just one final question, I think, if that's okay, as I think we're drawing to a close, but I wanted to, and it might be quite a big question to finish on, but I think it would be an interesting one to discuss. I just wanted to return to a point that Shahid made earlier on in the discussion about the interconnectivity between race, capital, and particularly climate change, and thinking, well, a question to our panelists around what role do they see cultural heritage playing in, you know, the ongoing and increasingly urgent discussions around climate change? How can our expertise within these fields be brought to bear on ongoing discussions, you know, finally at a high level politically, but, you know, the urgency is now very much there for change to happen, and how can our understanding of the past help to inform decisions that policymakers might make? So I open that out to all of the panelists, if we have an answer. Miri.
I just want to say about, as someone who works on the Middle Ages, I mean, you just have to respect how people preserved, conserved, were alert to issues of scarcity, to food insecurity, even people at the absolutely sort of pinnacle of the social order. Everyone was just the awareness of not, well, I suppose it's not taking things for granted. I mean, yes, you had so many great cities in medieval Europe where you could buy anything. You could buy anything from India, from China, from the Near East, from Africa, but people also were so aware of the fragility of it all. And of course, just at the level of techniques, I'm not saying that we will necessarily learn techniques from the past, but I suppose with a growing awareness to environment in our curricula, and it's too slow and it's all too recent, but it will become more present. I think this sort of conversation with the past will be impressive, and it's and also on issues that also have to do with health and maintaining well-being. I mean, of course, we have some fantastic things going for us that they did not have in the past, but this idea of sort of well-being, you know, being about maintenance of a certain balance in life, and it's something that it's about the day-to-day. It's not about crises that you fix, but that you try to prevent and you try to foster. There's some quite deep ideas there, and in other cultures as well. I just happen to work on Europe. That if that can enter into the sort of mainstream of historical consciousness, then I think that's not a bad thing, but it's not enough to solve our problems right now.
I could say, I mean, this analogy might be something of a stretch, but whenever European colonists first arrived in the Caribbean, the climate was pretty extreme for them. And the main economic reason for enslaving and importing Africans was that white Europeans didn't want to do the work because it was ferociously difficult, and the climate made that work almost impossible. So I'm not sure if we can draw a lesson for today, because obviously man's capability to withstand climate and perform work in different climates has changed and improved. But extremities of climate which affect economic performance often lead to exploitation. And I think that's something that we will need to guard against even further in the years ahead.
Thank you. Josephine, you had your hand.
I'm just thinking what has been said about you can't go on having exponential economic growth. Life's not like that. It won't work. And maybe one of the things one has to consider, which is a very human thing, is greed. When the motor car was invented, only rich people could have it. Then you get mass production. Then it's become the thing. All during my lifetime, I've seen people the first thing they want, if they've got some money and a steady job, is to buy a car. It's what they want to have. During lockdown, we've had that wonderful period when nobody was using their cars and we could see the stars in the sky that we don't normally ever see. And now it's going again. People want to have it and they regard it as a matter of independence. And that is a very difficult kind of approach to deal with, I think. You can't go around just saying you're greedy or, you know, you're ruining my atmosphere. But at some level, it does need tackling. And there are some foreign places that I've read about recently on videos on TV, and the prizes being given to people who've come up with green solutions. There are some extraordinarily wonderful things. One of them, I'm trying to remember which town it was in, but it's somebody who, in a place which has an extremely hot climate and has become more and more built up, where there's a space and there's nothing in it, he's planting trees with the help of volunteers. And it gave the figures for how much carbon was not being put up with this green shade, because it cools everything down. And also the trees help to absorb carbon dioxide quite quickly.
Mm. Yes, well, we green recovery is something we certainly don't have time to discuss today, but there is definitely, yes, lots to be said on that. Shahid?
Yeah, just in terms of the thing that was in my mind, and I'm not an expert to be able to put these things together, but for me it was the kind of ideological framework which I think has started to connect the kind of ideology of capitalism which has become dominant for many years, and connecting that to race and you know, ideologies of race and colonization and enslavement. And so it sort of politicizes, it places climate within a similar kind of political dimension as we've been discussing these other issues, and the kind of idea of this whole kind of idea of growth, as Josephine's saying, which is unsustainable, and growth as a kind of political ideology. I mean, there was a planning permission that's recently been granted. It was just in the architectural press, a building next to the Daily Express building on Fleet Street, which was built 20 years ago. There's an office block that was built 20 years ago. And this just been granted planning permission to demolish it and build a 22-story building in its place. I mean, the current building is maybe 5 or 6 stories. And, you know, that shouldn't be allowed to happen now at the point that we're at now. I mean, perhaps it happened, you know, that's the kind of thing that has been happening, but it's exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't be happening. So it's these kind of things, yeah.
But it's fine, because as Mike Graham told us on the radio the other day, we can grow concrete. It's sustainable.
Yes, as archaeologists, we're all really looking forward to this next round of what's coming. I think unless there are any further comments, my cat says, yes, it is tea time, please feed me. Almost on cue. But I don't know whether there are any closing comments from any of our panelists that they would like to share with the audience just before we wrap up. It's been a fascinating discussion for me, certainly this afternoon. It really wide-ranging in terms of scope and geographies and chronologies. It's been really a privilege to be part of it. Were there any final comments that you would like to you would like to make to me and the bear?
Yeah, thanks to all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the company.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the Society of Antiquaries, enormous thanks to all of you for being part of this discussion this afternoon. We really appreciated all of the thoughts and all of the comments. Yes, I'm so glad it's been recorded, because I think there's going to be a lot that people are going to want to go back and revisit in the future. So on behalf of the Society, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a very lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.